as far as when you're looking at pornography, one of the things that people typically get addicted to it with is because it's, you don't have to do a lot of being vulnerable with people. Having Asperger's to some degree kind of keeps you a little bit more closed off in some ways. Just certainly there's times where it's harder to be more vulnerable in some things. I think it's different for me now. But at the time certainly it was harder to be more open with certain people about different things as I was growing up. Obviously, I still was pretty self-conscious in myself, and I also feel like I had a lot of there was a lot of that kind of, this is what I was when I was a little kid, so I'm not going to fit in with my peers, as an adolescent. So a lot of those things kind of drew me into that and in a healthy sense.
What Patrick just described is something many boys experience but rarely articulate, the pull towards something that feels easier than vulnerability. When a boy feels self-conscious, different, unsure where he fits, and connection feels risky, private coping can start to feel safer than being seen. But as parents, there is so much we can do, especially when we understand how shame, isolation, and biology can quietly shape those patterns. That understanding can be the difference between your son learning to reach outward when things feel hard or learning to turn inward and carry it alone. I walk you through the 5 pivotal tips on parenting boys to help create that awareness. It's a free guide, and one of the first things we focus on is creating safety and reducing secrecy before those coping habits take root. You can download it for free at sonhoodcoaching.com in the resource section. Now, let's get back to the show. Welcome back to Unlocking the Parenting Code, all about boys. I'm your host, Kathy, and today I'm joined by Patrick Eilers. Patrick is a licensed professional counselor with nearly a decade of experience working with individuals and couples, navigating anxiety, depression, addiction, and life transactions. He has specialized in sexual addiction recovery, taught psychology at the university level, and now leads Bloomworks Concepts and Coaching. Patrick is passionate about breaking down complex psychological ideas and creating spaces where real healing and honest connection takes place. Welcome, Patrick.
Thanks, Kathy. I'm really looking forward to our conversation tonight. Thanks so much for having me on.
My pleasure completely. Patrick, if someone were meeting you for the first time and really wanted to understand who you are and the values that you live by, what would you want them to know?
Yeah, I think to start with, I mean, definitely part of my experience in my life has been I definitely have a strong faith foundation. I grew up in the church and a Christian faith foundation, so that's something that's pretty important to me. And in my experience as a therapist, most of my training is in sort of in that background space as well. So I do have kind of some theology within my space of psychology as well. So that's been very important to me throughout my career and very definitely part of my individual life. I also feel like it's important that, mental health has been part of my story as well. I was diagnosed at 11 years old with Asperger syndrome, which is now what is known as ASD. But having that diagnosis and pretty early, I mean, diagnosed late at that time, certainly, and so it's sort of been 2000, 2001 around there. Having that diagnosis at that point in my life was a little bit late for most folks, and some people are getting diagnosed, 3, 4 years old now. So having that experience certainly taught me pretty early on about mental health and just kind of what that looked like in my life and the way my parents supported me through that, just kind of helping me to, grow and learn. So certainly very early on in my life, I had some exposure to therapy and exposure to mental health awareness for sure in that sense, I guess I'd call it. And so pretty much since then, I mean, well, that's not directly the reason why I got to be a therapist, but certainly part of my story for sure. So that's been important for me as well. And just helping people. And I think, one of my big reasons I've wanted to be a therapist was because it's important for me as a person to know that there are people who've gone through. I didn't want other people to feel the same way I felt at different periods in my life, and certainly whether that be loneliness or whether that be feeling like you weren't really sure who you could really turn to or reach out to, and a lot of those feelings kind of were some of the things that motivated me to be a therapist. So I do think that it's important, no matter who you're working with, to always provide a safe space for people to be able to process and think about what they're going through and what they're experiencing. So that's an important part of my career and certainly an important part of who I am. And I think that does tie well back to my faith and certainly the idea that as a person, I want to be able to be provide opportunity for people. That's kind of the way I look at therapy, is that it's an opportunity to grow and to learn and to be able to take away. There's a a good quote that I found or years ago. I knew somebody who had a tattoo. It said, "How to turn your wounds into wisdom." And I always feel like that's a pretty good reflection of kind of what ultimately what therapy is about, and kind of ultimately my goal of helping people and supporting people in that way.
Well, thank you. Um, Actually, that when you were talking about your diagnosis at 11 and 12, that was kind of, I wanted to ask you a little bit about that in relationship to like your life before the diagnosis, your life after the diagnosis, how it affected your relationship with yourself and with your parents.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to remember too much before that. My biggest thing, I mean, I always did have some social issues, social struggles. I never really had a lot of people I was super close with, as far as my peers went, especially at the time, with being, probably for sure like fourth to sixth grade was certainly a tough time. All in junior high, I went to three different schools, so you can imagine that was not that wasn't an easy time in my life either. But so that was kind of post-diagnosis. But at the beginning there, I struggle with math. I'm horrible with numbers. I'm not good, which is kind of interesting because most people who have ASD typically one of the stereotypes is they're really good with numbers and really good with kind of analytics and that kind of thing. Not a strength of mine. So that was kind of really what kind of led us into that sort of space. My parents were, they were concerned about my school performance because there was only certain things I really was into and I liked. And I tried, I think, certainly at the time to be more interested in some of the stuff my peers liked, but I never really got into it. I was never super athletically gifted, so I didn't. My parents were not really into sports, so I didn't really do a lot of sports as a kid. So that was always kind of an outlier. And I went to a private school, so a lot of people, that's all they did, right? They were big into sports and they were big into kind of we had smaller classes and stuff like that. So there wasn't really a ton of people that I could always relate to in that way. So consequently, I was always very close to my parents in that way because of the fact that I really didn't have a lot of people I spent a ton of time with. I didn't do a lot of like sleepovers and stuff like that. That was not something I did as a kid. Really certainly as a very little kid for sure. After the diagnosis, I mean, I think really the big thing that, it kind of gave everybody kind of an explanation. My parents, I'm sure, struggled how to be able to articulate a lot of that stuff to me. My mom, particularly, was one who really kind of stepped up, and my relationship with her really kind of changed throughout my entire life related to that because of the way she's trying to help me understand what I'm experiencing. And they didn't know either. They didn't, and they certainly didn't understand the diagnosis any more probably than I did at the time. But my relationship with them is still incredibly close, and I have both my parents now has been very, as an adult, is quite different than it was even when I was a teenager. Like there was, I've really come to respect and love and care for everything that they've done for me as a kid, but also as an adult, and I have a really deep relationship with both of them. And so I think the way it changed afterwards was more that it was kind of how do you navigate now with being certainly going into junior high, how do you navigate other social issues? Why would how do you relate to our people and that kind of thing? I think the relationship with myself really was hard for a while because I always felt like the first couple of years for sure, I was always like, I'm gonna be this outlier. I'm always gonna have this outlying thing because I have, have this disorder that a lot of our people don't have. And come to find out later, I mean, one of the things that helped me actually start to train to be a therapist was the fact that because I didn't have a lot of social friends, I would kind of listen and talk with anybody. I mean, anybody was willing to come talk to me about whatever they wanted to talk to me about. So in high school, a lot of people would come and talk to me about their relationships, and that was very easy for me just to be able to talk to them because I didn't have anybody else to hang out with. So it was kind of like, oh, I kind of hang out with these people that are telling me about their relationships, and so that was pretty common later on throughout high school that people would come and talk to me. Like I said, I didn't really have necessarily a super gifted talent in certain areas of my like life, so to speak. I mean, I found out later on I had different ones that I wouldn't didn't explore when I was in high school, so to speak. But yeah, post-diagnosis was just kind of it's kind of looking back. The one year that stands out to me back in my if I'm looking at it would be when I was about 15. Is kind of really when I started to I think really start to accept what I had to navigate and looked at it more as being like, okay, like this is not going to make me an outcast for the rest of my life. It's going to be something that I can eventually learn how to be able to actually use it as strength. And I think that's kind of where I'm at now, is that certainly as a therapist, it's helped me be a better therapist, absolutely. Because I've learned so many things from other people, just talking to people beyond just in my own personal life, but also in sessions and stuff like that. So, I consider it a real strength now. It's not, there's definitely some things about me that are unique. I mean, I mean, you can tell as we're talking, I have to look at different things and kind of get away from direct eye contact to kind of think about how I'm, to kind of visualize what I'm thinking. But that's one major thing. I'd say another one is I do have some small idiosyncrasies about like things being in certain places and stuff like that. Certainly when I was younger, that was more of an issue than it is now. One of the things that as an adult that I tend to not realize is more becoming more of an issue is like really loud noises. I don't not a pretty big fan of super loud noises like stuff like that. Those can physically hurt your ears and stuff like that. That might just be me as a human. So it's kind of hard to kind of know some of these things may not just be symptoms. They may just be who I am. But yeah, it was just it's kind of hard to describe it fully because I don't think I even now do I understand it fully as far as what previous to the diagnosis was post. I mean, I kind of know what my life was post of it, but I don't really think too much about the previous of it. I just kind of know as a kid there was just certain struggles I had, and like I said, that really what led me into being diagnosed was really because of the physical the performance. Really, I guess is probably the best word. The performance I had at school was really kind of where my parents were starting to get concerned on that level.
Well, I think information is really powerful, just to understand yourself and for others to,
Absolutely.
so that the expectations are, you have an opportunity to be successful with expectations rather than the opposite. So, um, how did
Yep.
you, how did you come to focus on sexual addiction and pornography in your counseling work?
So pretty much from probably mm, not shortly, or probably not too long after my diagnosis, through most of my high school and into my college career, I had a battle with pornography myself because it's just something I think that most young guys, especially nowadays, navigate. And so I had this story in sort of my own life of like, this is something that was a struggle for me, and I knew kind of why that looked like and how that changed my expectations of dating and what I was looking for and different things like that in that aspect. And certainly there's a comfort in that. Certainly as far as when you're looking at pornography, one of the things that people typically get addicted to it with is because it's you don't have to do a lot of being vulnerable with people. Having Asperger's to some degree kind of keeps you a little bit more closed off in some ways. Just certainly there's times where it's harder to be more vulnerable in some things. I think it's different for me now. But at the time certainly it was harder to be more open with certain people about different things as I was growing up. Obviously, I still was pretty self-conscious in myself, and I also feel like I had a lot of there was a lot of that kind of this is what I was when I was a little kid, so I'm not going to fit in with my peers, as an adolescent. So a lot of those things kind of drew me into that in a healthy sense. So later on, when I was a therapist, I had the opportunity in 2020 after the pandemic started. I was working for a startup practice, and so I was kind of a general practitioner, and that practice split apart, and so we were kind of in a position of, which way do you go? And so I ended up going along with the practice owner who originally had hired me, kind of stayed with her, and just things that just didn't work out there. There was a variety of things that had happened, and so I had the opportunity when I was looking for jobs. I came across this job for specializing with sexual addiction. I figured, well, it's something in my story. I can kind of relate to it, and I never specialized before, so maybe I need to try this part of the field. I haven't had a whole lot of success leading up to that point in my mind, so I was like, well, maybe I need to give this a shot. And so, which I'm grateful I did because I learned a ton, and I learned a lot of stuff that I needed to learn as a therapist and as a person. And I wasn't necessarily planning on staying 4 years. My original goal was that I knew I was going to be there for some period of time because the process of learning an addiction program, at least the one we were using, is like 4 to 5 years long for people. So it's a long process. And so it's basically an inpatient, which would be like a 40-day, really intense therapy, inpatient for people that they modified to being outpatient. So it became, so it went from 40 days to basically 30 steps that were over a 5 year period if people went straight through the program. And so I wanted to make sure that I got a chance to give it the entire chance of going through before I made a judgment if I really wanted to do this or not. And probably by the end of, I'd say, year three, I was pretty sure that this wasn't really where I wanted to stay. But I gave the extra year because there were some circumstances that just led me giving it a chance. I figured 4 years probably was enough to figure out if I was going to do this or not. So combination of my own story, but also just because of the fact that it's a huge need. And so I was like, okay, this is an area where, I can definitely help people and stuff like that. And so I do feel like like I said, I took a lot away from that. I mean, I'm a way better therapist than I ever was before then. And I think just the tools and things I took away from that program of what I could do, what I couldn't do, what I was learning, my own voice, the self-confidence I gained in my own self, being able to do those things. Working with sex addiction is a lot harder than I would have thought because at the time it was like, oh, it's going to be challenging, but I don't know how challenging it's going to be. And now being on the other side of it, going back to general practitioner work, I'm like, this is seemingly easy, which is I'm not, I don't mean like that way because it's that being a therapist is a tough job, but in comparison, there's certain aspects of higher emotion with when you're dealing with betrayal and you're dealing with sexual addiction, those kind of things. That's different than working with somebody who maybe like in a general sense. Um, so yeah, that's kind of where how I end up in that particular setting.
That's interesting, and I would think because of the work that you do, the more you understand the different complexities of relationships and just people in general, the more the deeper the quality of support you can give to people who want support. So,
Yeah.
so I have two questions, and I'd like to say both of them together because they go together, and you can mix them up or address them separately or whatever. But the two questions are: what role do you think biology, particularly testosterone, play in this conversation? And how do we talk about male biology without either demonizing it or using it as an excuse?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Certainly, I would say that most of the program work that we did focuses really on, sort of initially where what people's stories are. And a lot of addiction work, and I don't know if this is entirely accurate for all addictions, but certainly most addiction work or verbiage around addiction has a lot to do with trauma, right? So again, that's a bit of an overused word, so I'm careful using it, but basically emotional to physical, right? There's kind of a spectrum, right? So we have emotional traumas are kind of the lowercase t stuff, but they're still as impactful. They could be a divorce, they could be a loss, they could be those kind of things, all the way to the physical traumas, which are we're much more familiar with, combat, life-threatening things, those kind of physically life-threatening things, that kind of stuff. So a lot of like testosterone conversation it would be in there. There's a biological piece to it, certainly, but a lot of the conversation around addiction is usually coming from what is the person's story, what's their belief around sex, how do they use sex, those kind of things. So when you bring in testosterone, if you're talking about in that aspect, I would say that really how does it play a role in the sexual addiction? I think one of the things is a lot of people will commonly say, well, I'm hypersexual or I'm more sexual than somebody else. That's a very common thing. You hear that a lot. And really, it's not so much the fact that the person may be hypersexualized because of testosterone. It may be because it's how they're focusing on. So I always tell people that, like, pornography is not just necessarily pornography by itself. There's also a lot of sexualized things that are not meant to be sexualized with the internet and stuff like that, right? And so what ends up happening is people hyperfixate on those particular things, and it tends to elevate their thought process of what they're thinking about. So the more they think about sex, the more likely they're going to want to act out because that's a way to relieve their stress, relieve their anxiety, those kind of things. Now, testosterone, I would say, can it elevate or lower during those periods or like related to that? I don't know if I have any direct correlation or like stats for you in that sense. But I do think that there's an aspect of the fact that like yes, men have testosterone, and there is a part of that plays a role in bringing people probably to look at sex in a little bit different way than maybe a woman might. I definitely know men typically look at sex, either a visually or B through touch. So touch is a very like, sex is love kind of thing. There's definitely a belief usually around that. But for women, usually it's about safety. But I would also argue that for men, it's also about safety too. It's just a different kind of safety. It's a different kind of emotional safety in that way. Can testosterone play a role in that? I probably would argue it would lean to the idea of yes. I don't necessarily know that it would have a direct. Does that make somebody more sexual? Probably necessarily not. I guess I would say it like that. But I do think that can it be one of those factors that might cause them to utilize sex in an unhealthy way? That's probably pretty accurate to say. Again, this doesn't mean that that's every case, but I definitely feel like there probably are a few more people who would say that they have a higher testosterone level potentially. I know like there's certainly a lot of enhancement drugs that talk about raising testosterone, and then one of the consequences of that, positive or negative, is that more sexual activity will occur. But I would also go back to the same idea. Like there's a potential that I feel more. If I feel better, I might want to engage in sex in that way, because I'm feeling more, elevated mood wise and those kind of things. If somebody's really depressed, they're probably not going to engage with sex in a healthy way. They're probably going to use it to try to escape or to those kind of things, which is typically where you see most people utilizing sex as an unhealthy behavior, is in either some type of numbing or some type of escaping. I don't know if that totally answers all those questions, but
Well, it
so.
does. Testosterone is really something that I've been trying to understand because, and often when I ask people, nobody seems to really know much. Like, we know the things connected with sports and puberty and things like that, but like the real in-depth understanding of how does it impact behavior,
Mhm.
I've been trying to understand it more. One of the things that gave me a little more insight, like it really gave me a lot of insight, and I thought I want to learn more. And it was a TED talk, and it was about transgender, and it was someone who had been born a woman who went through the process of becoming a man. And so that included all the hormonal changes and everything. And what the man said when he was talking about the process he went through, both physically and emotionally, he said when he was a woman, he might, be walking down a street and look at a person and think about their physical appearance and just kind of, oh, they're beautiful or whatever,
Right.
very
Mhm.
kind of not superficial. And he said when he started having more testosterone, his mind kind of just went on high speed and it was all sexual. And so he really had
Mhm.
to use control and restraint not to act upon all that wild stuff that was going on in his head. And it makes me think if that's how it is for men, if they're always, in certain stages of their development, having to work at controlling impulses that most people don't recognize how hard they're working to control those
Right.
impulses, and often they don't recognize themselves why all this is going on, which creates more shame, and that's
Mhm.
another,
Yeah.
tumble road to get on. What do you think? When I was raising my son, I longed for a guide, something real, honest, and grounded in what boys truly need. So I created the book that I wish I'd had. Packed with tools and real world strategies that actually work, you'll learn how to nurture his emotional world and finally understand the feelings behind his behavior. Because boys don't need punishment, they need guidance. We'll bust the myths that keep boys boxed in and help you support him through the real challenges of growing up. Most of all, it's about transforming your connection, one small moment at a time. Raising boys who become remarkable men. Get your copy today and let's create a beautiful future together.
Well, that's an interesting in that sense, right? So that was their experience, that they feel like it hypersexualized their how they were thinking about things. And I would tend to lean to the idea that yes, I think if there's elevated testosterone, there's probably more likely that some of those things, like you said, right? When you're in puberty, you have more chances you're going to think more about sexual behavior and those kind of things. But I also would wonder, at least some of that idea, like, how much of that was also changing some of the perspective when it comes to either connection or back to, like we said earlier, kind of does testosterone potentially change how a person feels like, engaging sexually is going to, affect how they are connected with other people? Like, there's a possibility of some, I wonder how they might answer that question. Because, yeah, the thoughts are part of it, but I also wonder, like, what was also their engagement of other behaviors? Like, seeing somebody in public, typically most people will acknowledge that person's attractive. But usually it is more a visual sense, right? So it's visual stimulation. But I would say that, kind of going back to like what we talked about before with a lot of the guys I've worked with, is like it's partially it's about breaking some of those thoughts and not allowing those thoughts to continue to, overcome you. Because the more you think, like I said earlier, the more you think about it, the more likely you're going to be able to do those things. And so the impulses are about, what do you have your mind set on? Is it set on the things that you want to do in your life? Is it set on like, what sobriety looks like for you? Those are a lot of the questions we would typically ask people because a lot of times if your thoughts are racing about sex, you're typically going to more likely put yourself in those positions. And that's where I feel like more of it has been related to social media and some of those kind of things have elevated the thought processes. Now, is that affecting testosterone? It might. I don't know if I don't know if there's any research out there that says it does or doesn't. But I would say that I do think that because of social media and because there's a lot of stuff that's hypersexualized in our culture, it tends to amplify the thought processes for people. And so because they can't break from those, almost like an anxiety, you can't break from those thoughts. That tends to be one of the reasons why people will typically want to escape or try to find ways to, you know, navigate that in a healthy way. And also factoring in what's their stress level and what do they do to, have good coping skills. Most folks don't usually, and also men particularly, typically don't have a lot of good, healthy coping skills. They tend to, the way the analogy I use is there's a bucket and their bucket fills up all the way. And then when you act out or you watch pornography or you masturbate or whatever, it's like the water overflows the bucket just enough to basically bring it to that much again in the bucket. So every time there's more stress that's pouring into your bucket, it just keeps overflowing. And so that's typically because people aren't doing healthy self-care and reducing the water from the bottom. They typically have that. That's usually their threshold of stress is very minimal. And so there's that factor in as well. I've put that in there too.
Yeah, it's kind of complicated too, isn't it? Or it
Yeah, and I,
seems
and
to
I
be.
wasn't, and honestly, I wasn't really sure because like the testosterone is an interesting way of going about it. I certainly think it's an interesting insight. I just, like I said, most of the time from our conversations I've had in the past, and knowing what the programs talks about, there's a series of things that sort of are genetic, that are within like the framework of these are like fertile ground. This is a ground that most likely will bring addiction about. There is some genetic components to that, but it also is related back to behavior. So like if your dad has Playboys, for example, and your grandfather had Playboys and your great grandfather had Playboys and they're just around and you kind of normalize that behavior. Now, does that elevate testosterone? It might very well, but that behavior is usually looked at as kind of a fertile ground for that modeling, for that to occur. So again, doesn't mean it has to be because certainly nowadays we have kids that are like 5, 6 years old that are accessing, pretty hardcore pornography at a very young age, because of the internet and that kind of stuff. So they may not have a background doing that, but if they access it when they're kids, that can definitely start that process early.
I guess when I think more about testosterone, it's just really trying to understand, you know, why is pornography so alluring for, males? And pornography is alluring for females, but it's usually in a different way, and it doesn't
Yeah,
seem to
different
be
way.
as intense. Like the intensity doesn't seem to be the same at all. So one of the things that makes sense is if it's our hormonal differences. And like if I slot that into my thinking, then it makes it, it's like having that information. I can maybe be a little bit more compassionate when someone has an issue with that, rather than thinking that they should be able to control themselves as well as I would as a woman at the same age and stage. So I don't know, I think I find it quite interesting that it doesn't
Yeah.
seem to be an area we know enough about to be able to understand each other better. So, okay, so thinking the same thing, you talked a little bit about digital access and there's a lot of stimulation going on. And when our boys are younger and their brains are developing, it could be like the perfect situation for things to go off track. So
Yep.
from a parent's point of view, what is it that parents can do? Like you said, that because of social media and access, there's a strong possibility or almost a probability that your son is going to be exposed. They're probably going to be interested, and they might get into trouble with it, like because they don't know how to
Sure.
handle it as well. So what do you do
Mhm.
as a parent before that happens? And then what do you do when you know that your child has been exposed?
So typically, one of the things that we always used to share with people, and again, I didn't work with too many really young guys. There were a few adolescents I worked with at different periods, but some of those fertile ground moments are certainly, like we said, if you live in the home where it's not discussed, if you don't really talk about sex, if sex is kind of a taboo topic, that's one of the things we might look for. Definitely an early exposure. We were just mentioning, certainly if like, anywhere probably under, let's say 12 and under for sure, but probably anywhere between 12 and 15 could even be considered an early exposure. And that could be anything. That could be, run across online. That's the most common now, but certainly in the past, it could have been early exposure with another person. It could have been, there's lots of different things that could constitute that. Certainly, another area that would look for is that would be like, is this something that has been, I guess kind of the secrecy aspect is really the big thing. That's what I always tell parents from the beginning part of it is that if I was a parent, the number one thing is making sure that the devices are not in anywhere where the opportunity can arise. So the phone doesn't go to the back, and I tell this to the same guys that are over 18, same thing. Like phone doesn't go to the bathroom. Phone doesn't go to the bedroom. Phone's not allowed to go any places where it can be alone with you. Again, you're going to take it to school. You're going to take it to work. But again, when you're there, it stays in open places. At night, it goes into a basket or some type of a garage, so to speak, at night. So it doesn't go to places where I have access to have opportunity. That's one of the biggest things you can reduce that is if you can reduce opportunity, your chances of not running across it go up. Very, very common where your brain knows different areas. So like bathroom's a very common one. If I know that when I take the phone to the bathroom, I have no intention of acting out, I have nothing, I'm never even thinking about it. The second I close that door, all of a sudden my mind's racing. Oh, look, the door is closed. You have opportunity. You can take that. So that's a for parents really limiting opportunities, I think, is really kind of the big thing. Now, obviously, phone, again, you could do like a digital phone or not digital phone, like analog phone versus a digital phone. You could do that kind of idea. That's a possibility. That way, they don't have access to the internet. Or like one of those phones, it's like a really limited phone where basically it just can call and text and maybe gets on like one site or whatever the case is. I know they have things like that. Stuff like that can limit some of those things, but really it comes down to, I think, that aspect. So limiting exposure, and then the other thing you can do is really, again, have conversations within age range that's appropriate. Certainly, the really young kids, I would say one of the big things is that, look, there's going to be things that are going to come up that your buddies are going to want you to see and want you to experience. And if that comes up, would you be comfortable talking what they want to share with you? And we can talk about what that means and what that looks like. Now, again, that's different for everybody's experience, but I do think like, making sure that some of those conversations are more open because we know that the more secrecy there is around sex, the more likely that curiosity is going to make you want to do more things. You're going to want to be more exposed to it. You're going to want to learn more. And unfortunately, a lot of pornography is people's sex ed. So what ends up happening is like that's their exposure. That's what they know sex to be, is whatever they've experienced through pornography. Another area it's going to be kind of building onto that is that people are going to be able to create their own intimacy. So AI, robots, all the stuff that we're kind of going down that direction is you don't have to learn how to talk to a woman. You can just talk to a robot, and the robot will make you feel some of the same stuff you feel with a woman. So again, those conversations are going to be looking like, okay, technology is here, but that doesn't replace, relationship. And so that's an aspect of like helping to continue, I think, make the parallel between sex and relationship and sex and like intimacy in that way is really important. And again, you're modeling that as a parent as well. Certainly not necessarily modeling in a sexual sense, but certainly modeling that within the sense of, okay, like we're being open about this and talking about it and being, so I think those are things that help that way. But the biggest issues that we would run across with people is typically like this is something that became a coping skill because at an early age it helped them feel better about whatever was going on. And so that's really where I think the long term is the issue is that if your kid has other healthy coping skills in their life and tools in their life, that will also maybe reduce some of that too because they won't be turning to that as being kind of an escape. Especially like if like let's just say for instance if you're bullied a lot when you're an adolescent, and you can watch porn with these beautiful women and you can masturbate and escape from all of that. That becomes very alluring in that way because you can get drawn to that because you don't have to deal with kind of the reality of bullying and those kind of things that happen that way. That's just an example, but that's a kind of a common storyline of a lot of people because they know that they can go and turn to this escapism, and it makes them feel better. And it's something that's very quick and like very easy, very quick access, and that kind of thing. And that's what I always tell people too. You're two clicks away from acting out. It's Google incognito mode. Like, and so it's also important to realize that we're not that far away with when you add social media in there and some of the other things. There's a lot there that can happen real quickly.
What did you mean when you used the phrase the vulnerability robber? What does that mean?
And when so you're talking about like
I
robbing.
read I read something that you had written, and it was about the
Oh, okay.
vulnerability robber.
Well, I do think that like sex or not sex, sexual addiction or unhealthy behavior tends to rob us of vulnerability, right? Because we don't get a chance to be vulnerable with our partner. We don't learn how to be vulnerable within our human being. And so what that does, it tends to rob us of that opportunity because we can just turn into ourselves. And so a lot of pornography and a lot of unhealthy, pretty much all unhealthy sexual behavior. Like people ask me, like, can you do this and can you do that? And I'm like, all that stuff is really kind of personal discretion, I think. But really, what it comes down to is, do you want to learn how to be able to be more vulnerable with a human, or do you want to learn how to be more vulnerable with yourself? And if you're more vulnerable with yourself, you're more likely you're going to turn into all those unhealthy things because those are the things that you're going to be are all about you, right? Pornography is all about the viewer. In most cases, all about the viewer. Chat sites are all about viewer. AI is all about like all that stuff's about what you're doing and what you can create versus learning how to be able to adapt with somebody who is a partner, learning how to love them as a person, learning how to adapt with them as a person, grow with them as a person. So I think vulnerability gets robbed from those things when we turn too much into ourselves and too much into those behaviors that isolate us from our people, which is a lot of what pornography does. Some of that's shame based, so certainly there is an aspect of that the more shame I feel, the more likely I'm not want to share that with people. But then I think also the other side of that is okay, it's shame based, but then on the other side, I can always justify that pornography will never say no. Pornography is not going to hurt me. Pornography is not going to do the things that human beings do. At least that's what I can tell myself, right? And so, kind of on that cycle, you end up, really losing a lot of vulnerability with other people because you continue to isolate from our people because you're turning more and more into you. And that's where I was probably meaning in that way. I have to know the context, but that's probably what I was referring
Sorry.
to. So
Yeah,
that
I
was
just
I
when
just
I read it, I thought it was very interesting. So I should have given you more background to that. But the way you explained it right there, then, like, would that tie in, like, would social media also be considered to be robbing boys of vulnerability and girls too, as well?
I think in that case, so I go back to like consumeristic dating is kind of the same category with social media.
Okay.
It's that you're not learning how to be like vulnerability feels like it's one of those things that people do to get more attention rather than trying to be authentic. And that's where I worry about social media. Sometimes people are being genuine. I'm not saying that everybody on there's lying, but certainly the aspect of if vulnerability gets you attention or does vulnerability get you authenticity? And I think ultimately you have to add like that's where like are we teaching boys and girls, are we teaching them authentic, genuine connection through social media, or are we teaching them that if you do certain behaviors and you move your body a certain way or you pose a certain way or you look a certain way, um, that's going to get you more attention. And so I think that there has to be a conversation around what's attention versus authenticity. Authenticity is always going to be from a place of vulnerability. And so if you don't learn how to be authentic with other people, then you're going to be kind of putting up a facade. A lot of times what they, in the addiction world, it's kind of called like your secret life, right? So you're compartmentalizing who you are. You're one person on social media, you're one person at school, you're one person at work, you're one person at your family, whatever the case is. And so you learn how to adapt to all these different places. And probably all of us as human beings have a little bit of compartmentalization, but I would say to the point that people get so good at that they can literally disconnect themselves from behavior and do things that they would never thought they were going to do because their addict, quote unquote, is taking over what they're doing in that sense because they need that higher draw to get more of the outcome that they want. So certainly some of those behaviors, and again, pornography it doesn't always elevate what people are watching. Sometimes it elevates in the amount of time that they're using it. So I've very commonly seen people go from like what took 5 minutes to get them, aroused can take 15, 20, an hour, 2 hours. And that's how it affects people's lives, more so in the sense that the more time you spend into it, the less time you get with other people. and the less time you have for you. And so you're involved in this behavior that essentially takes you away from more and more of your life because you need more and more to find what you, because again, you're chasing the high kind of thing. So that's very common where it doesn't always mean that sometimes it's elevation of what you're watching, but also it's just sometimes the elevation of time. You can watch a lot of the same kind of stuff, but your elevation of time goes, increases.
You wrote that one of the biggest challenges that boys or young men face today is social media, the decline of masculinity, and the hijacking of sexual desire. Can you talk a bit about those?
Well, I definitely think for boys, one of the big challenges that they run into, we kind of just talked about some of those, right? So, like you said, often I said authenticity with invulnerability with other people, certainly with other, not only just other men, but certainly with also with women. I think that's a big thing. And so, understanding what is true masculinity from a perspective of understanding that, masculinity doesn't always look what the world sees it as. Sometimes it's about learning that, there's certain roles that men have and boys have in society, and so are you learning what those roles are and being able to, not necessarily I would say adapt to those, but certainly being able to embrace those to whatever it is that you feel like you're learning about yourself, and how does that reflect to that? And so I think there is a lack. There's more people telling people what they should do and what they should look like and what they need to be like or what's important. And that again kind of erases that often authentic space for most people. They're not able to be who they really are. And I think that also undermines a lot of the things as far as our sexual desires, because sex is a very personal thing. And that's why a lot of people talk about it, because it's one of the most vulnerable spaces. Usually, when you have a couple, for example, the two big areas that they struggle with are sex and finances. And those are two of the most vulnerable places in a relationship. And so you kind of go back to the same idea with guys and men, particularly at this era, is like we just don't know what it's like to be able to be in the space of being vulnerable with those things, because those are things you don't talk about or you kind of keep in private, or it's the secret that everybody does that nobody wants to talk about kind of thing. And so there's a lot of those things that are eroding, I think, what people understand men to be and what men are going, what men are moving forward to continue to grow into. And so that's, I think, part of where a lot of the authenticity gets lost, because there's so much of this idea of, okay, like, well, this is what everybody expects it to be and what it's best to look like, but it doesn't actually end up looking like that because really in a position of like it's not authentic. It's just basically based on what a reflection of everybody else kind of thing. And so that ends up being, I think, a little bit of an issue from, again, and kind of go back to like pornography, that pornography tries to, I think, dictates a lot of what people think that they like about certain aspects of people. Physical body type is one example I could think of. Like, you're supposed to like a woman who looks like this, or you're supposed to look like a woman who acts like this. And that's another one of those things that pornography is doing. I think it's damaging to some degree, because it's painting women in a certain light, just as much as it would be for women if they were to see men in a certain light. And so these belief systems then translate into dating, and because dating is a consumeristic approach, when we go online and look for somebody online, now we're looking for somebody the way they look and the way they're going to be. I'm attracted to them and the way that they immediately make me feel, then rather than learning how they actually are as a person and being authentic with that person and growing with that person, and learning the ups and downs of that, and learning how to be resilient, because dating takes resilience. There's just a lot of people who get very traumatized. I don't want to use that word, but that's basically what it is. Of that they expect that the person they're going to go date is going to cheat on them, and they have that expectation. And if they have that expectation, then they're not going to be dating sincerely either. And so both parties have their guard up, and they don't really. I think that's consistently why people don't want to be together, because there's so much of this belief that I'm going to get cheated on, I'm going to get left, men are always going to hurt me, women are always going to use me for something. Those are very common beliefs. I've heard a lot of those throughout my career. And so those belief systems are really coming from a place of it really in authenticity. It's really more based on where those come from. Some of those are from porn, but some of those are also just from, the way the society looks at a lot of vulnerability and, and again, authentic spaces in that way.
So, how would you describe, or what would you give for a definition of what it means to have healthy masculinity?
Well, healthy masculinity, I think, from a perspective of just understanding, and like again, I'm coming from a little bit of a bias, so I'm coming back to a faith perspective for me, is that I do think there is an understanding that men do have certain roles and again, that doesn't mean that they can't be they can't not participate in other roles. It just means that they have to, I think they, how do you support, how do you be a leader in your relationship with your partner? How do you, and again, that doesn't necessarily mean that doesn't look like just being the sole provider. Certainly you could be, a provider in other ways in the relationship. It doesn't just mean you have to be financially a provider. Certainly being in the leadership position and helping, again, lead the relationship in a direction. Obviously, your partner's helping you with that too, and you're working together there. But certainly that idea of leading together. So I do think that's an aspect of it. I do think that healthy masculinity is defined by, ongoing vulnerability and openness in that sense, and that's really tough for a lot of guys. Like it's hard to be open and acknowledge that there's moments that we're weak as being human just as much as anybody else is, as much as women can be weak. We all have those moments. And so part of that is being vulnerable and being, again, back to authentic in that idea that, look, we're not going to be able to overcome our pain, just by pretending it's not there, kind of thing. And that's what a lot of guys are taught to do. Understand that your emotions are part of who you are. And I think one of the things I've seen a lot with an increase in men, particularly with anxiety, is because men typically their anxiety shows up as anger, and so there's a lot of increase of people who are angry, really more so because they're anxious, not because they're necessarily are angry people. It's because they're really scared people. And so men tend typically show that uh, through much more anger, and I've seen a lot of that through my career, even before I worked with sexual addiction. So I think understanding our emotions are part of who we are, and that that's not necessarily a bad thing. The other thing I guess I would say with that too is that, are you willing as a man to be sacrificial to some degree for your partner, for your family? That's one of the things I think is we're kind of in a space we're losing a little bit of that, right? Like because people don't want to be hurt, they feel like everything has to be out of equity. And there are times where relationships are going to be equal, pretty close to equal, and then there's going to be times where they're not. And so, can we adjust and adapt to that? Are we willing to be able to, as men, to be sacrificial to our partners and to our families and the people that we care about? Doesn't mean we sacrifice ourselves so much to the point that we end up draining our bucket that I was kind of talking about earlier, where we don't have any energy left to give people. And a lot of men will do that. They'll work and they'll pour all their self into work, just to try to sort of attain that, but then it doesn't always work out that way because then they lose themselves. And so being able to be honest about your strengths and your weaknesses in that and continuing to be sacrificial in those moments as best you can. And that's not easy. That's certainly something that's really challenging to do. But I think that's again going back to vulnerability. Like that's where two people need to turn into the relationship, not turn out. And a lot of people tend to turn out when those things start to happen because it gets hard, and that's part of it. It is hard to be in a relationship, uh, any kind of relationship, but specifically a romantic relationship has its own certain challenges for sure.
For
So
sure.
hopefully it gives a good definition. I don't know that I gave you kind of like bullet points of it, not like a
Yeah,
like an official
I
definition.
no, it sounded good. Patrick, before we finish up today, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wish we had of?
No, I think we covered everything. I guess I'd say that the one of the things I always tell people, and I always usually sign off on most of the podcasts I always do with, every breath is a second chance. It's a line from a group called Switchfoot. It's one of my favorite bands, and one of their songs that they did is "Every breath is," that's the line in the song. And so I always think about that for people that, um, no matter where you're at in your life, as long as you have breath in your lungs, you have an opportunity again to work toward better and work toward improvement, work toward healing. Healing is something that it's never complete, I don't think. I think there's parts of our lives that we are always trying to heal more from. It doesn't mean that we're ever going to be completed, but are we getting better from there? Are we becoming stronger? So you think about somebody who, breaks their leg or has an ACL tear or something like that. Like they have to work how to learn how to walk again because their leg gets weak. And so that's a lot of what like mental health's a lot like that too. Like we're not broken, we're not too far gone or anything like that. If you still are able to breathe, you're still able to make decisions, you're still able to go forward, you have hope to be healed. And that's something that, I think you kind of said earlier, what's one of the things, and I didn't mention that part, but what's one of the things I like to instill with people within therapy is that you always have another opportunity to be able to make a different decision, as long as you have breath in your lungs. And so I always like to sign that off as a kind of a hopeful place because all these conversations we had, no matter how you feel about it, I think ultimately that if you believe that you can make another change and make an improvement in yourself, you can certainly do that and have the hope. And hope is for the things that have yet to be seen. If we don't have hope, then we don't. When we what do we have in that sense? So we have to be hopeful that we can be different, and it doesn't take overnight, but it's small wins and small consistency. So we used to always say in the addiction space that you're not perfect. We're not trying to be perfect. We're trying to live in excellence. And if we can, as men, for sure, can we live in excellence? A lot of men focus on perfectionism. They wanna do it right every single time. And I always tell people I use an NFL analogy, or I use with the Olympics going on, like a gold medal analogy, that every play that's in the NFL is not done perfectly. Nobody runs the perfect route every time. Nobody has the best defense in that sense. But there's people who do it enough times that they do it in excellence and they're able to win a game. Same with the person who won the gold medal. Their first gold medal run that they win the gold medal with is not that every step that they took to win that race or to be part of that activity, whatever it is, was not done perfectly. But they did it more steps correct than not, and they were able to do that in excellence. And so, hopefully, I can walk. People can walk away from this episode of this podcast that they can at least feel like they can live in excellence, as parents and as parents and as men, as boys, everybody we've talked about in that way. Hopefully, they can realize that they have that ability.
Well, thank you. It's a lovely way to finish it because this is quite a heavy topic and it's heavy for parents and it's heavy for men. So thanks. That was a very
Absolutely.
nice way to tie it off. Patrick, where can listeners connect with you if they want to learn more about your work?
Absolutely. So LinkedIn is probably a good way to get in touch with me. So LinkedIn, Patrick Eilers, MALPC. You can also check out my website is patreon.com/bloomworks. And that's one word. And all of the Bloomworks stuff has a bunch of mental health resources for folks. Some AI worksheets I've created, some trainings I've done, some different things on digital wellness I've done. All the podcasts I'm part of, all that stuff's on there. So people can check that out. I try to put as much as I can there for people to use the resource. You can also reach me on Instagram. It's Ray_PGE. That's my personal Instagram. I don't post a lot of stuff, usually typically business stuff there, but that's something you can check me out there. And then really, I always tell people if they want other podcasts I've been on, if they haven't gone to my site, you can also go to YouTube and just type me in. There's some ones on it I've done. So those are some good place to connect with me.
Yeah, that's what I did. I watched quite a few of the other interviews just so I'd get a feel for the person who'd be sitting across from me. So I will make sure that I include all those in the show notes. I know how precious time is, and I hope you feel that I've honored your time today. And it has been a
Absolutely.
real pleasure to talk with you, and I've learned things, and I'm sure our listeners will as well. So thank you very much, Patrick.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
And thank you to our listeners for joining us on Unlocking the Parenting Code, all about boys. Be sure to check out Patrick's links in the show notes and don't forget to subscribe, share, and turn in next time for more conversations about boys and men. Thank you for sharing your time with me today. Every conversation we have here is a step toward raising boys who feel seen, heard, and deeply valued. If you're looking for more support on this journey, I invite you to visit me at sonhoodcoaching.com. You'll find a link in the show notes. And as always, thank you for being part of this important movement. Until next time, take good care.